There might be a physical explanation for Moses' miracle. It may not have been like the classic movie, The Ten Commandments. In fact, a new study published by PLOS indicates that strong, persistent winds could have been a major factor in the sea's movement. So they did these computer simulations recreating 3,000-year-old acts, and then they found that 63-mile-an-hour winds blowing for 12 hours could have actually pushed the water to bend. Scientists based their study on shifting depths over waterways over time.
Some, of course, hold to this idea of the Reed Sea, that there was a marshy area that the children of Israel crossed over. But there is some latest discoveries in the last 25 years that are very provocative. One is on the eastern shore of the Sinai Peninsula at a place called Nuweiba. And the last is at the Straits of Tiran, the very southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Also has some very interesting evidence, remembering that evidence on the Sinai Peninsula itself with its monastery has none.
A DNA research scientist who investigated the biblical accounts with a uniquely scientific approach. For Dr. Moeller, it began in 1995 when he joined others to investigate the claims of the Exodus, looking for physical evidence on the bottom of the Red Sea. They were searching for chariot wheels encrusted in coral.
The hypothesis is that the biblical text from the book of Exodus is a true historical document. And this text contains clear clues concerning the route of Exodus, which has led us to this location at the Red Sea.
And the thing is, I use the same methodology that I do in the laboratory. And if DNA is an ancient text, if you like, we have ancient text also in the Bible. So in one way, it's very similar. But you can use a scientific approach and see if you can verify these events and if you can find connections, etc. And that is what I've been working with. And you can call that forensic medicine, if you like.
Forensic medicine. And by the way, there are a lot of forensics at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba because you've found the evidence of a disaster. And the disaster, of course, is well documented in the Bible. Pharaoh's army was destroyed there. A lot of people think that's a fiction. You don't think it's a fiction.
Well, again, when I follow the story and you end up at that location, at Yam Suf, that is called in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, then, of course, you must investigate the seabed. And first you see the character of seabed, and then you can actually do a lot of finds. And these finds represent remains of animals and humans and chariots and other things. And that just represents a disaster a long time ago. But put into the context of the whole event and the things before and after, it is a piece of evidence, as in a court case.
Beginning at the Nuweiba Peninsula, the wash over the centuries has created sort of a land bridge across the Gulf of Aqaba there, all the way to Saudi Arabia. And then the wash coming down from Saudi Arabia has helped to put that land bridge together. It's just an amazing thing. If you remove the water, you could actually walk across.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that, as you say, it's from two different directions. It has been washed out of these wadis. A lot of gravel and sand material. So in this very deep part of the seas we have on Earth, it's actually 6,000 feet deep. We have what we can call a kind of an underwater bridge. The interesting thing is that if you remove the water there, you're on dry ground because it's this gravel character, so the water immediately disappears.
Yeah,
and it's
solid,
solid ground for horses or chariots or whatever. One of the things that had to be fulfilled at the crossing site.
Now, when you put an underwater camera down under there, and when you did diving in that area, you found what appeared to be chariot wheels.
Yes, we found things that have that appearance with a hub and spokes in different directions. We can see human skeletons. We can see different parts of, let's say, the femur, this part of the body. We have complete skeletons from humans that we can see. We see horse skulls, and it seems like it's twisted into one another. As a kind of disaster, it's something that just happened and forced these together, and yes, things like that.
Amazing. From the ancient maps that you've collected, you found that the land of Midian is over there just on the eastern shore of across from the Nuweiba Peninsula.
Yes. in today's Saudi Arabia. And if we look at ancient maps and we look at documentation, whatever, the land of Midian has always been on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's still today called Majan.
The Nueba site is interesting in that when you travel to this portion of the Gulf of Aqaba, the children of Israel would have, if they took this route, would have come to a place where there is a large sandy beach that abruptly ends a journey across the Sinai Peninsula. And what is unique about this particular area is a fellow by the name of Ron Wyatt discovered a bridge of land linking the Sinai Peninsula with the land of Midian, and it was only about 200 to 300 feet below the surface.
Gentlemen, why did you, I didn't know that Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabian territory. Why did you think it was?
We found some chariot parts that looked like the chariots found in King Tut's tomb in the Gulf of Aqaba, west of this Jebel El Lawz. We found these at depths from 60 feet out to 200 feet and over a stretch of about 1.5 miles. And we believe that that was the crossing site. And so in the biblical narrative, they arrived at Mount Sinai after crossing the Red Sea. The language in the Bible indicates that they stayed in a mountain, enclosed in a mountain. So an aerial map showed that this Jebel El Lawz had a large valley enclosed in the rim of an ancient volcano. There's about 5,000 acres in there. We felt this was the place. And in Exodus 24:4 and in Leviticus 6:28, 11:33, and 15:12, it tells of some artifacts that were to be found. There was to be 12 pillars of stone and an altar and some pottery. And so this is why we looked at that particular mountain.
He did some archaeological exploration around the area and discovered a number of very interesting items. One was a large pillar which had no inscription on it, but when he traveled to the other side, to the Saudi Arabian side of the land bridge, there was also a pillar, quite large, that was there, and it had Talmudic writing. It mentioned Solomon, Moses, and there was some writings on this post which seemed to indicate that these were markers for the crossing of the Red Sea. Ron Wyatt also said that he discovered buried in the coral some artifacts that, when closely examined, looked like chariot wheels and parts of chariots there embedded in the coral along this land bridge. And so during the late 1980s, when this information was first being revealed, there was a lot of skepticism, but it was the first bit of real evidence that showed that there had been something that took place on this eastern shore of the Sinai Peninsula.
Across the valley floor from the base of Mount Sinai lie the remarkably preserved remains of the altar to the golden calf. Once again, I was miraculously able to slip inside the fence undetected and record the images of cattle literally covering these rocks. These petroglyphs, or rock carvings, represent distinctly Egyptian gods, with Hathor being the female representation and Apis the male. These gods were actively worshipped in Egypt during the time that the Israelites were held captive there. The story is relayed to us in the 32nd chapter of Exodus, where the people grew restless, waiting for Moses to return from the top of Mount Sinai. The people told Aaron, "Up, make us gods to go before us." Aaron took their gold and fashioned for them a molten calf with a graving tool. What is intriguing about the story is that he fashioned a single idol, yet said, in sight of all of Israel, "These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." The scripture makes the same point later in the chapter when Aaron is explaining to what happened to Moses. He claims the people wanted gods to come before them, so he took their gold out and out came a calf, once again singular. Looking at this site, however, the scripture becomes beautifully clear. Aaron prepared an altar to the idol, and then set the calf on the very top. The cattle you see here were carved right into the rocks upon which it sat. Standing back from the spectacle, one would have seen a golden calf sitting atop the rock carvings of Apis and Hathor, their former Egyptian gods. The calf, along with the images beneath it, would have been correctly spoken of as plural. These be thy gods, O Israel.
Okay, what's encompassed in this picture, the outer red ring is a fence that the Saudis have, of course, blocking this area off. But you can see that the landform comes up a bit and there's like a high platform. This area is larger than the size of a football field. It's enormous. And we do have, as we were speaking of earlier, a biblical precedent that to mark a grave, Jacob took a stone and stood it up as a pillar which marked the grave of Rachel. So it was something that they did do in this day and time. All of these gravestones are standing out there in this field that the Saudis have marked off.
Yeah. A friend of ours who had done some lightweight wave imagery of this site, he said all the graves went in at one time. How they know that exactly, I'm not sure, but that was the conclusion that he had come to.
What he said was it appears that all of this ground was disturbed at once. In other words, first off, it's in the middle of nowhere. You don't have enough nomadic population in 1,000 years to produce that amount of graves. But secondarily, the ground appears to have all been disturbed at once. So what we would be talking about is a mass burial in the middle of nowhere. Why? And it's not, the markers there are not in what we have been told, and we lived in Arabia for a long lot of years, they're not burials that are marked in an Islamic fashion. So our best guess is that this happened sometime long before that era, and it all happened at once, and it just happens to be a couple of miles or kilometers probably north out of this area where this congregation would have been, if we're correct about the fact that they were there in this valley.
The greatest witness giving validity to Mount Sinai being in Arabia is the rock at Horeb. This enormous rock is split cleanly down the middle and is completely different from anything else in the region. It stands high atop one of the boulder hills that dot the landscape and on the west side of Horeb, not Sinai. The Bible identifies it exactly this way. I'm standing on the back side of the rock here, and it's easy to see just how large it really is. I began to notice immediately the deep channels that were cut into the stone both in front and the back of this rock. You can see one of these channels clearly here. With rainfall every 10 years amounting to less than an inch here, these very obvious cuts made by copious water flows were indeed compelling. Again, the channels are obvious.